Hi, welcome. You're listening to People, Planet, Food, conversations about the global food system that I hope are both a cause for optimism and a call to action. I'm Roger Robson-Williams, Chief Sustainability Officer here at Plant and Food Research. I'm interested in how to grow healthy, affordable, enjoyable food in ways that don't harm people or planet. In this podcast series, I'm talking to some of the inspiring people I've met about what needs to change if we're to have healthy people living on a healthy planet and eating healthy food. In this episode of People, Planet, Food, I'm delighted to be talking with Stephen Wallace, a sustainability manager working across 2 science organisations in New Zealand. We're going to hear about Stephen's role in making the way we do science more sustainable. Stephen's worked at Plant and Food Research since 2018 and became Sustainability Manager in 2022. For the past 2 years, he's been working across AgResearch as well in a collaborative approach to sustainability that I think is benefiting both organisations. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you, Roger. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I've had the pleasure of working with you for a couple of years now and would count you as a good friend as well as a good colleague. But for many listeners who don't know you, perhaps you could explain a bit about the work you do across these 2 science organisations?
For sure. So as the Sustainability Manager at Plant and Food Research and AgResearch, I see my role as advancing the sustainability agendas of both institutes. And primarily this has focused on greenhouse gas emissions, but in a broader context, it's about raising awareness of sustainability for everyone in the Institute and how they can play a part to make the planet and society better.
Well, that sounds exceedingly worthwhile, and I'm really interested in how you got into this line of work.
So that's a bit of a story because I've always been interested in the environment, and I did study the natural sciences, biology, zoology, botany at university. But I then worked in a totally different area. And after a while, I decided that I really wanted to do science. So I started working at Plant and Food as a research associate in post-harvest, which was great. And what I discovered was that the Institute at that time didn't have a compost facility at the site that I was working. And that really struck a nerve with me. And so I lobbied, communicated, gained the trust and confidence of people on site to start compost. And I guess that was sort of dipping my toe in what became a broader role in the Institute, which was really keen to see me do more things. And so that has just led to where it is today, where I'm now full-time across 2 institutes advancing sustainability agendas.
I think it's really interesting that you kind of started off getting your hands dirty and at the grassroots level kind of helping with sorting out composting, and I know that was at our Mount Albert site in Auckland. Could you say a bit more about some of the things even that you've been doing this week, which are possibly operating at quite a different level within these organisations?
Yeah, so just this week, we were talking to the senior leadership team at AgResearch, and we were discussing what's called a materiality assessment, which is where you ask stakeholders what they think is important sustainability-wise. And we were talking to them about, or giving the results back to the SLT about what the people were saying and how that is perceived within the Institute. And I guess the whole focus of how the Institute conducts itself with respect to sustainability. So very high level and sort of considering things at the strategic level as opposed to putting gloves on and turning compost.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for that. And we might well come back to that later in this conversation. But I do think it's wonderful that you've been able to, or you are still able to, transition between the hands-on grassroots activity through to influencing senior leadership teams. So kind of well done for that. Are there particular people that have inspired you on your journey so far in your sustainability career?
That's really quite difficult for me because I can't think of one particular person who has inspired me. I think there were lots of people along the way that both did things in a private capacity that was really inspiring. As an example, I have a colleague who volunteers his time to deal with a particularly noxious weed in Auckland, and I found that really inspiring, that in the weekend they would take a photo of a weed they saw in a railway corridor and they would go out and get rid of it. But at a broader scale, people who have managed me previously have always said, make sure you're doing something that resonates with you, and they've given me leeway to engage in sustainability activities, which I found really inspiring as well.
Well, that's great that you've had the opportunity to express your interest in sustainability whilst doing other things. It's something you're doing kind of full time now. And earlier you mentioned specifically work on greenhouse gas emissions to address concerns about climate change. Could you tell our listeners a bit more about what that actually means in practice for the two organisations that you work for?
So for greenhouse gas emissions, there's a international standard, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, that is much like a set of financial accounts. And there are rules and regulations as to how these emissions have to be recorded. So it's quite a technical process. And what we have to do at both institutes is go through our inventory, which is all the things like the number of flights that staff at the institute takes, all the way down to the amount of fuel that people use when they drive a company car, or things like the amount of freight that gets purchased by the institute. And all of these things have an emission factor, which is how much carbon dioxide equivalent they generate or put into the atmosphere. These all get summed up to provide a tons of carbon dioxide equivalent for the year. And all of this data is vetted by an external company to make sure that we're telling the truth and that it is an honest and accurate reflection of the emissions that the Institute does. And this has to be done each year to report on, so that you can you start with a baseline year and then you can go forward and project emission reduction targets.
Yeah, okay, thanks for that. Now, I get the importance of measuring emissions so that you know where you stand at any particular point in time. But given what you used to do with turning compost, you're clearly a man of action. And I'm kind of interested to know what you are trying to encourage these two organisations to do to actually reduce their emissions now that you've helped them get a sense of what their carbon footprint looks like.
I think what's really important is that in a lot of cases, there is a lack of transparency over what is happening. So just like with the compost, people were putting their rubbish in the bin and they didn't realize where it was going and what could be done. And so with the emissions, the first thing that I think is really important is to just highlight what the emissions are, where they come from, and how big they are, how much of a problem it is. Or not, depends. And then from that, you can start making informed decisions. And obviously emissions is something that everyone has a role to play in. And I guess that's where providing some evidence and some data to the institutes to say these are important things that we have influence on, that we can make changes to reduce our impact on the environment, means that it's a better place for people to come and work in, and people can have pride that their place of work is doing the mahi to combat climate change. And I guess in the same way that I had to evidence what was going on, why we needed to do something about compost, why we need to do something about our fossil fuel emissions is no different.
Yeah, okay, so that's about kind of winning hearts and minds, making the case for action. What actual actions are happening on the ground?
So once people are on board with making action and they realize that it's an important thing to do, there's very practical things like energy audits to look at where you're using your electricity or fossil fuel for space heating. And then, you can identify quite quickly that we're not running LED lighting at all our sites. And so you can change out your fluorescent bulbs to LEDs, which drastically reduces your electricity consumption, the emissions associated with that. You can start charting in transition plans for fuel switching at sites that have reticulated natural gas, or switching to efficient heat pump hot water systems rather than electric cylinders. There's quite a lot of practical, technical things that can be done if you've got the evidence to say these are generating emissions. We can reduce our emissions by doing these steps. And I'm really thrilled to say that both the institutes are totally on board with going through those steps and identifying where we can make changes.
Oh, that's good to hear. Now, you mentioned fuel switching, and I wonder if you could just explain to listeners what you mean by that and why it's an important thing to consider doing.
Yeah, so in New Zealand, we have a system in the North Island where we have a natural gas coming from gas fields off the coast of Taranaki. And so, historically speaking, when buildings were constructed, they were heated with space heating with gas or electricity. And that was a cost decision. And obviously, we're now acutely aware of the emissions that are associated with natural gas heating. So the term fuel switching refers to switching the heating or the energy source from fossil fuels to electricity. New Zealand's very unique in that we have a very high percentage of our electricity coming from hydro generation, which has a very, very low emission factor. So in a lot of cases, the first thing we're doing is to reduce and hopefully eliminate our natural gas consumption and replace it with electrical sources of energy. And this is termed fuel switching.
Great, that's really clear. And presumably that's something that any organisation that uses natural gas or oil or coal could or perhaps even should be considering?
Absolutely. And it's something that actually goes beyond organisations, and it goes all the way into your home. In certain jurisdictions overseas, governments are musing on whether or not they should mandate a ban on gas hobs in the kitchen, because it is no different to a gas heater at the company that you work for. And I guess it really just brings the point that all fossil fuel use is generating emissions, and we need to consider that very carefully when we use fossil fuels.
So something that I quite often hear people talking about is the concept of carbon offsetting. So paying for somebody, for example, to grow trees somewhere to draw carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So why perhaps not do that instead of, for example, incurring the costs of fuel switching from gas to electricity, for example?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I would say there's two things to consider here. The first thing to consider is that it would be naive to think that we could reduce fossil fuel consumption to zero. There's always going to be a need for fossil fuels. And an example that I would give is that, when you're at your summer holiday and you break a leg and they have to call the rescue helicopter to come and pick you up, that is probably going to be a fossil fuel helicopter for some time. And there's no technical solution that I'm aware of that could change quickly. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, therefore, if we're going to embark on offsetting, the offsetting should be for those emissions that we cannot remove from society function, like the rescue helicopter. So if we're offsetting those emissions, the capacity to offset is very limited. As an example, I think the statistic is something like if everyone in the world planted a tree today, the amount of emissions that those trees would soak up would be something in the vicinity of 5 minutes of that day's cycle of emissions. The point being, it's just an infinitesimally small number of emissions that offsetting can take care of with the present technology that we have. So we have to be very careful when we consider offsetting. We've only got a limited amount that we can offset, and therefore what we do offset should be the absolutely critical things that we as a society value. And so there's not really an excuse to not fuel switch when you can and offset, because there are things out there that cannot fuel switch. And so offsetting should be reserved for those. That's where my thinking is at the moment. And that's generally reflected in a lot of sustainability spaces, but there's always exceptions.
Thanks for that. I have to say that's an explanation that I hadn't really heard before as clearly as that, and I think that's really makes a really good case. So just building on that then, in your own life as a private citizen, is there anything you can do yourself or are doing to kind of fuel switch to avoid the use of fossil fuels?
Yeah, it's been quite a journey for me, because I didn't grow up in a household that was particularly, shall we say, environmentally conscious. We were always quite cautious with resource use in general, but I didn't really think twice about driving a car or using a gas hob. And so I've really looked at my personal life with a close attention to sustainability. And a couple of things have come to the surface. The first one was that my partner and I drive ICE vehicles, which is an internal combustion engine, so a petrol car. And we realized quite quickly that we should stop doing that if we can. So what we have done is we have purchased an EV, an electric vehicle, and we have committed to taking a bicycle to work whenever possible. And I guess you can then extrapolate that out to all areas of your life where you know that you consume fossil fuels, and think about the impact that they have, and are they necessary, and are there alternatives? And I guess the other thing that has been quite a personal discovery for me was looking at something as simple as mowing the lawns. And I thought, well, actually, I don't have to use a petrol lawnmower. There are other lawnmowers out there. And I discovered that there's even a scythe. And so I guess what I would encourage people to do is look at where they have fossil fuel consumption in their personal life and think about what options exist to reduce or eliminate that if possible.
Thanks. Yeah, and just for listeners that may not be familiar with what a scythe is, it's essentially a knife on a handle for cutting grass, and technically not easy to use and physically quite demanding. So all credit to you, Stephen, for taking on board scything your not insubstantial garden. Congratulations on that one. So I'd like to zoom out a bit for a few minutes now and get some of your thoughts on some of the other sustainability issues that really impinge on that kind of intersection between people, planet and food. You've talked about carbon emissions as being a key thing. What other issues do you think that we as a society should be paying attention to in our food system?
Well, probably for me, something that's quite close to my heart would be nature, or if you wanted to get more technical, would be biodiversity. And I guess in a sustainability sense, why this is important is that it comes back to how we view ourselves in the landscape. And so if we consider ourselves as just a part of the landscape, and we look at what other components of the landscape there are, the trees, the grass, the birds, the worms, the water, the soil, all of these things have a role to play in making people and planet healthy. And so something I think that sustainability tends to focus on is very tangible things that people can deal with. But actually there's a whole lot of, dare I say, more difficult problems that are harder to deal with, but are just as important. And I think biodiversity in nature is probably one of those.
And are you seeing anything in the kind of regulatory space or businesses responding to that as perhaps the next big thing after dealing with or starting to deal with greenhouse gas emissions?
There's certainly internationally recognition that we need to do a lot more here. You might have heard of the term the Anthropocene, if I'm saying that correctly. And there was recently a COP, which is a conference of the parties. So all the governments of the world get together, and they spoke specifically about biodiversity to try and reflect the fact that at the moment we are losing species at a rate that has never occurred before. So species of plants or animals are dying at a rate that has never been seen before. And the legislative changes that are being debated are to protect a certain percentage of the world's environment to try and arrest this decline. I think it is coming, and I think certainly it's going to have impact on the decisions that we as individuals make and also as companies. But it's quite a complex area, so getting to the practical details might take some time.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier about people seeing themselves as part of the kind of landscape rather than apart from it. And I understand from that why you would feel at quite a visceral level that it was important to protect other species that we share the planet with. But somebody who might not feel that from the heart to quite the same extent, are there kind of practical reasons why we should care about losing species on the planet?
There are. There's an expression that I really like, and it's called, I think it's the rivet redundancy theory. And this is that if you were in an aeroplane and it was flying along and someone said, I think we need to take some of the rivets out of the wing because the plane's too heavy. And so you go out onto the wing and you start drilling out some of the rivets. And then you think to yourself, how many rivets can I remove before the wing breaks apart? Because the rivets hold the wing together, and that's what's keeping the airplane in the air. And the person says to you, well, I don't know. We'll just keep going. When environments lose species, those are like rivets. And what the environment does for the planet is it gives us the air we breathe. It gives us the water we drink. It gives us the food we eat. These are critical things for our survival. We can't exist without them. And so every time another species goes extinct, that's a rivet in the airplane wing. And there will be a time, no one knows when, where those things no longer occur. We won't have air to breathe, we won't have water to drink, and we won't be able to grow things in our soil. And so there is a very real threat that we need to pay attention to. And it affects everyone, whether or not they see themselves as part of nature or not. They are, and they depend on it. So the rivet redundancy theory is my answer.
Thanks. Yeah, no, that's a very visually arresting analogy to use. Thanks for sharing that. So what can organisations like Plant and Food Research and AgResearch do to try and arrest the decline in biodiversity, given that agriculture and horticulture is a big land use and can be as a cause for biodiversity decline?
Well, at both institutes, we have a lot of people who spend a lot of time and energy researching and thinking about this. And there is some really cool stuff going on. And I can't speak to those science projects, but what I would say at a bigger level, a food system level, is that we need to consider how the system operates. And so at the moment, food production, by and large, is driven by an economic motive. And so there's efficiencies. For instance, the number of dairy farms in New Zealand has reduced over time, and the number of cows in the herd has increased over time. And this is to reflect economies of scale, that you get greater efficiencies. But what that also means is that the number of things that those farms have to then do to make a profit becomes more driven by economies of scale. So if we could think about this at an individual farm level, if you've got more flexibility on how you farm or how you run your orchard, I guess you can give more room for nature. So I think in the considerations of things, we need to give space to nature, we need to give resource to nature, and how that specifically manifests itself in the food system will depend very, very much on where the farm is and what it's doing. But I guess it comes all the way back to we need to view food as something that is not so extractive and financially driven as more of a custodian or more of a caretaker role. And food production is one of the things that happens when we look after the land.
Yeah, thanks. And are there some examples you can think of where you're seeing that, I guess, dual values or benefits coming from a food production system that is both producing great food for people and supporting biodiversity?
There's a lot of examples I can think of where people have done specific things to deal with specific aspects or issues. There is a huge concern in New Zealand about water quality, and as a result, there's been a lot of work around planting riparian or waterways, and that has really had a big impact on both creating space for biodiversity, but also improving water quality. On the flip side, there is also a number of enterprises that have eliminated fossil fuel use on farm or drastically reduced it. And this has been achieved by, yes, investing more capital, but also by changing the practices of how they operate their enterprise so that they don't have to use fossil fuels. And so I guess what I would say is that there are examples out there, but they're not necessarily mainstream at the moment. You probably have to look a little bit harder. And I guess to give you an example, there is one where research has shown that you can have native plants on the boundary or the shelter belts in paddocks, and these attract pollinators that can pollinate crops or pastures, but they also have natural predators that predate on pests in the crop or pasture. So you don't have to rely on pesticides and herbicides so much. So those are the sort of examples that I can think of.
Yeah, thank you for that. So there is reason to be hopeful that multiple values can be gained from the same kind of block of land if you use it thoughtfully in those kind of ways. Hugely. And I know things like integrated pest management takes a holistic view around what levers can be pulled and what ways we could do things. And I think that going forward, what we conceptually think of as a farm or a food producing area will change over time. And I think that there's huge reason to consider that all the research that's being done now will integrate and weave together to produce something that will be much better for the planet. Very good to hear. What practically could a listener do if they were listening to this and thinking, I'm keen myself to do something to arrest the decline in biodiversity in my kind of garden or on my land?
Well, living in Aotearoa, New Zealand, one of the big issues we have is invasive species. So I would urge you to have a look at Predator Free 2050 and the great initiative that's going on there. And that's about reducing the impact that invasive species such as rats and mice and stoats and ferrets have on our native flora and fauna. The other thing I would think about is if you have a look at your garden, for example, there's so many ways where you can plant native species in your garden as opposed to planting exotics. And that's not to say exotics aren't great, but you can just weave in elements of native species such that it supports native biodiversity.
And is that something that the organisations that you work for are or could be doing?
Oh, I think definitely they could do more. It's always challenging when you've got 1,000,001 ideas around how you could improve the Institute's sustainability performance, but these things always have trade-offs. So I'm always passionately advocating that the Institutes plant more native species.
Mm-hmm. And you are clearly, and I know you to be a pragmatic person, very principle driven, but also very practical. And so I'm interested in your kind of vision for the food system in 20 or 30 years. What would you like to see in terms of some changes?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that go on in the food system today that are driven by consumer demands. And I guess an example of this is the phrase people buy with their eye. So, yeah, if you're buying an apple, you want to buy a perfect apple. You don't want a blemish, you don't want a scab. Ideally, you want uniform color, and you certainly want shape that's uniform. And in reality, anyone who has an apple tree will know that some apples don't look perfect. Some apples have skin discolorations or blemishes. So I would really like us to move to a food system where we weren't so worried about sort of preconceived ideas about what an apple should look like, but also what a farm should look like. So if you went to the shop to purchase food, you would purchase an apple that was from your local orchard, and it wasn't necessarily perfect, but you were really happy to buy it because you knew it came from something down the road. And in the same way, when you drove past your local farmer, that you could see their stock sheltering under the shade of a tree in the hot summer sun, and you were then happy to buy your produce from that farm. So I would like to think that the food system going forward would have more connectivity with the people who are eating the produce. And there is a slight disjunct there because New Zealand exports a lot of our produce, and I think that's really important. But I think if we can have greater connectivity with the people who eat the food locally, and also with the people who eat the food internationally.
That issue of food provenance is very coherent with your view on people being part of the landscape rather than separate from it. So it seems to me to be very consistent the way you're thinking about those two things. And certainly that vision for the food system is something that I could personally get quite excited about as well. So thanks for sharing that. I'd like you to share something else now, and that is a kind of a book or a podcast recommendation that you would make to listeners who are interested in finding out a bit more about sustainability, not necessarily just related to the food system, but the state that we're in terms of the health of the planet and what we can do about it as a species.
I'd probably have to think. Let me offer the book I read over the summer because I really enjoyed it. It's called Ahu Ahu, and it's about the conservation journey that New Zealand has gone through, starting with sort of the remote islands that the now Department of Conservation manages, but then scaling up to be everyone in New Zealand and what conservation means and how we can get involved with that. And I think the book really succinctly talks about the challenges that we face, the scientific response that we as society have had. And I guess principally and most important for me, it really well highlights and demonstrates that over time, people's opinions and thoughts towards things change. And so the social norms that we operate in, they change over time, and they are informed by the science we do, which is why I really enjoy working at science institutes, because you're at the cutting edge of the science that occurs. And I guess an example of this is, if you go back in New Zealand's history, there was a time when everyone was trying to bring in exotic species to make New Zealand like the places that they had left, the European settlers I'm meaning here. And that was culturally accepted as the right thing to do. Today in New Zealand, we have very strict laws about what you can bring into the country. And we're very proud of the native species that we have here. And we're doing, in many cases, a whole lot of energy and effort to return them to the abundance that they once had. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that that's a cultural shift that's occurred. And it's been informed by the science that has gone on. And I feel that the food system will have that same transition, or at least I certainly hope it will. And I think the research that Plant and Food and AgResearch does is part of that. So to answer your question, I would read the book Ahu Ahu.
Thanks. That's a wonderful recommendation and a very insightful explanation behind why you would give that recommendation. So thanks for sharing that, Stephen. One more share, please. If you were talking to somebody looking to get into sustainability as a career for themselves, what advice would you give them?
I think the first thing is it's a bit daunting, and so be bold would be the first thing I'd say. But I would also say talk about what you think you might want to do and how you might want to get involved. It doesn't have to be something big. It can be something small. And the journey of 1,000 miles starts with the first step. If you're passionate about sustainability, any little activity or action that you can do is fantastic. And start with that and build from there. And if you can bring people on the journey with you, that is huge, and that would be the first thing that I would start with.
That's wonderful. And it reminds me of something that another wise person I spoke to recently said, which was, if you're trying to get into growing your own veggies, start just by growing something you like eating, which I thought was also great advice. So my last question to you, Stephen, this afternoon is, if you had a superpower to make the world a more sustainable place, what would you do?
Well, I'd like lots of superpowers, but obviously I've only got one. So I think it would be to make everyone realize the situation that we are in today is not what is normal. And by this, I mean, I think the term shifting baseline sort of describes it. But essentially, if you speak to your parents or their parents, they had different normalities when they were alive and young. And so if everyone could realize that what is done today is not the way it has to be done, it's just how it is today, and yesterday was different and tomorrow will be different, I think people would be much more flexible and adaptable to considering changing their practices and ways. And I think if we're able to look back and see what the world looked like, I think everyone would have a very different appreciation about how the world might look going forward.
Thank you. That's really deep, and I'd quite like to have a totally separate conversation to unpack that some more. So thank you very much for that. It's been a real delight having a chat with you. Thank you very much indeed, Stephen.
Thank you, Roger. It's really great to talk about sustainability and I guess share my experience and enthusiasm. So thank you.
Well, thank you for doing so. And to my earlier comment about this podcast series being about a cause for hope and a call for action, have you given me cause for hope? Absolutely. Have you put down a call for action? Well, amongst other things, we should all be ditching the lawnmower and getting ourselves aside. So thanks for that. And I really appreciate your time this afternoon. And for the listeners out there, thank you so much for listening to this episode of my podcast series. If you're interested in more conversations about people, planet, food, then please subscribe to Sigest and rate and review these podcasts. And obviously, please share them with others who you think might be interested in this series. And if you've got any questions or suggestions for people that you think should be featured in this podcast, then please do contact me on sigest@plantandfood.co.nz. Mā te wā. See you next time.